There are losses that make no sound. No one is abandoned in front of a crowd. There is no pleading, no public panic. Yet inside, a psychological structure quietly collapses and never returns to what it was. This is what happens when a narcissist loses true love, not temporarily, but permanently. For most of their lives, narcissists live by reflection. They exist through the gaze of others, through admiration, through the feeling of being chosen, needed, desired. Love, for them, is not a refuge for vulnerability, but a structure that props up the ego. Then someone appears, someone who does not love the role, does not love the mask, but loves the person behind all those defensive mechanisms. A love that cannot be manipulated, cannot be adjusted, cannot be commanded. And that is what changes everything. Sigmund Freud pointed out that when human beings love, libido, the life, energy, desire, and ego investment is transferred to the loved object. For a healthy person, the withdrawal of libido can be painful, but there is still a path back. For a narcissist, there is not. Because what they send outward is not merely affection, but the very foundation of the ego. When true love departs, libido has no refuge, and the ego, for the first time, is left exposed before its own emptiness. This is not a story of ordinary regret or remorse. It is the story of a silent collapse, in which the narcissist does not suffer because they lost you, but because they lost the sense of existing while being loved without performing. They may find someone else, they may continue living, but there is one thing that can never be recreated. The moment they were once seen exactly as they were and then lost that forever. And from that moment on, collapse is no longer a question of if, but only of how it will unfold. To understand the narcissist's collapse after losing true love, we cannot approach it through the language of morality or surface emotion. We must go deeper into the structure Sigmund Freud called libido. For Freud, libido is not merely sexual desire, it is life energy, the current of psychological investment that determines what we attach to and thus how we exist in the world. In people with a healthy ego structure, love is a two-way movement. Libido is invested in another person, but the ego retains a sufficiently stable inner axis, so it does not disintegrate when the relationship ends. The pain may be deep, but that energy can be withdrawn, redistributed, and gradually restored. For the narcissist, this mechanism does not exist. From the beginning, they do not love to connect, but to shore up inner fragility. The loved person is not an independent subject, but a support for the ego, a place where libido is deposited to keep the self from collapsing. This is why the greatest paradox arises when a narcissist encounters true love. True love does not operate on blind admiration, does not require roles, does not reinforce fantasies of omnipotence. It sees the person behind the mask. And for the first time, the narcissist experiences something they have never known before, being loved without control. In that moment, libido is invested not only in reflection, but in the experience of being human. That is why this love becomes dangerous and cannot last within a structure that survives by control. When insecurity arises, the narcissist does not recognize it as a signal of inner vulnerability. They respond with familiar mechanisms: manipulation, withdrawal, devaluation, reassertion of control. But true love cannot exist within a system that denies authenticity. So it leaves not as a punishment, but as an inevitable consequence. And here, the decisive moment occurs. Libido is withdrawn from the loved object. For a healthy person, this marks the beginning of mourning, a process of grief, painful yet with a way through. For the narcissist, Freud called this state melancholia, pathological depression. The core difference is this: the narcissist cannot withdraw libido back into the self for reinvestment because the self has never been a safe home for that energy. When the loved object disappears, libido has nowhere to go, and the ego, long propped up by external reflection, begins to disintegrate from within. In melancholia, the anger originally directed toward the loved object is not acknowledged, but internalized. The narcissist does not consciously register that they have lost you. They feel only a vague emptiness, an unnamed sense of ground giving way. They do not mourn you in the ordinary sense. What they lose is not a person, but a psychological function that allowed them to feel real. And when that function disappears, An ego incapable of self-support turns against itself through anxiety, buried shame, and an unspoken sense of worthlessness. At this stage, what appears first is not grief, but numbness. There is no dramatic collapse, no outward panic. On the contrary, the narcissist often enters a state that others easily mistake for being fine, having moved on, already over it. In reality, this is not strength. It is a primitive ego defense, in the face of a loss that cannot be processed. According to Sigmund Freud, when a loss exceeds the ego's capacity to contain it, the mind does not confront it directly, but freezes emotion to postpone the truth. The narcissist does not say, "I am in pain," because that would require admitting that something truly touched them, and that threatens the entire structure of inner power. Instead, they create a cold distance from their feelings, as if not touching the pain will make it cease to exist. Outwardly, they may behave as though nothing significant has happened. They continue working, continue social interactions, may even appear relieved. But this is not peace. This is ego shock, a blow to the ego that forces the defensive system to operate at maximum intensity. Because if they allowed themselves to fully feel the loss, they would have to face a dangerous truth: that this love was not merely a relationship, but an anchor for their existence. In this state, narcissists often believe or convince themselves that the loss is only temporary, that the other person will return, that control still exists. This is why the denial phase is often accompanied by a false sense of omnipotence. They do not cry, because they believe they have not truly lost anything, and that belief protects the ego from immediate collapse. But beneath this denial lies a dangerous paradox. Emotions do not disappear, they are merely pushed into the unconscious. Libido has been withdrawn from the loved object, but has not been acknowledged as lost. That energy does not return to the self, nor is it released. It hangs suspended within the psychological system, creating a prolonged state of latent tension. The narcissist may feel inexplicably empty, unfocused, sleepless, or irritable, but they will not connect these signs to loss. What matters is this: at this stage, the narcissist has not healed at all. They are only postponing. Emotional numbness allows them to continue functioning in the world, but it simultaneously lays the groundwork for the next psychological distortions. Because when denial can no longer sustain the illusion of control, the repressed energy will seek another outlet, and that outlet is rarely quiet anymore. When the numbness of the previous stage begins to crack, the narcissist moves into another state: obsession. Not loud, not acknowledged, but constant and persistent. This is when denial is no longer strong enough to keep libido frozen, yet the ego still cannot accept the truth that the loss is permanent, and when libido has nowhere to return, it begins to circle within memory. According to Sigmund Freud, when the loved object has been lost but not psychologically let go, libido clings to the mental traces of that object. For the narcissist, memory is no longer memory, it becomes a substitute space for the control that has been lost. They begin replaying old moments, words, glances, times when they felt loved, needed, seen. But what they are searching for is not you, it is the state of ego they inhabited when you were still there. At this stage, narcissists often fall into idealization of the past. Conflicts, wounds, and the truths that caused the relationship to collapse are pushed to the margins. In their place appears a revised version of memory, one in which they once had power, were once central, once irreplaceable. This is not healthy nostalgia. It is an unconscious attempt to restore a lost sense of omnipotence. The paradox is this: the more they idealize, the more they suffer. Each time memory is summoned, it both comforts and tortures. It comforts because it allows the ego to feel, "I once had." It tortures because reality no longer corresponds to that memory. The gap between an idealized past and an empty present grows wider, creating a form of psychological tension the narcissist does not know how to release. During this phase, many narcissists begin to rewrite the story. They may tell themselves that you have not forgotten them, that the relationship could have been different, that with one small adjustment everything would not have ended. These narratives are not meant to find truth. They are meant to protect the ego from the feeling of being discarded. Because admitting that true love has left also means admitting there was something they could not hold, could not control, could not possess. What is crucial to understand is this. In this obsessive phase, the narcissist is not moving any closer to healing. On the contrary, they are trapped in a libido loop where life energy is held inside memory rather than released or reinvested. They may appear to be reflecting, to be thinking things through, but this is not insight. It is the ego searching for a way to survive in a reality that has withdrawn the mirror that once reflected it. And here, something begins to shift profoundly. Memory is no longer sufficient to sustain the illusion of control. When replaying the past no longer soothes the emptiness, the narcissist is forced to face another, more painful truth, that no version of the story can return them to their former position. From that moment on, obsession ceases to be a refuge and becomes the first sign of an approaching collapse of control. At this stage, the narcissist is no longer merely thinking about loss, they begin to feel the consequences of losing control. Strategies that once operated smoothly suddenly become ineffective. Seduction no longer produces the same responses. Silence no longer makes anyone turn back. Ambiguous signals, probing attempts, familiar push-pull maneuvers all fall into a void. And here, for the first time, the ego touches its own limits. According to Sigmund Freud, when the ego suffers a severe blow, a narcissistic injury, the response is not always grief, but often a collapse of control. The narcissist once believed they could shape outcomes through will, strategy, by regulating the emotions of others. But true love left not because of any specific conflict that could be repaired, but because the relational structure could no longer contain authenticity. There is no leverage to pull it back. This sense of losing control does not arrive all at once. It comes in waves, each time a little more, like repeated pulls of the rug. Each response that never comes. Each silence that remains unbroken. Each sign that the other person has truly moved beyond reach. And with each miss, the illusion of omnipotence, the thing that once kept the narcissist upright, begins to crack. At this stage, many narcissists shift from silent obsession to emotional volatility. It may appear as groundless irritation. It may be anger with no clear target. It may be a constant inner tension they cannot name. But the common thread is this: they no longer feel central. And for the narcissist, losing the central position is equivalent to losing existential orientation. The danger lies here. They have not yet accepted the loss, but they can no longer fully deny it. The ego is trapped between two states, unable to return to the past and not stable enough to enter the present. This is when many narcissists attempt escalation, intensifying manipulation, testing reactions, creating disturbance, or trying to provoke emotion from a distance. Not because they seek connection, but because they need a sign that power still exists. Yet the more they escalate, the clearer their helplessness becomes. And that helplessness produces a psychological turning point. The narcissist begins to realize, however vaguely, that there is a kind of loss that cannot be repaired, a limit that cannot be crossed, a love that cannot be summoned back through power. This realization does not arrive as a clear sentence, but as a deep, lingering emptiness that gradually erodes the capacity for self-soothing. From here, collapse is no longer a distant risk. It has begun, not loudly, not visibly, but through the successive failure of familiar mechanisms of control. And when control is no longer a refuge, the narcissist is pushed forward into a stage where the ego not only loses power, but begins to turn against itself. When every attempt at control has been exhausted, the narcissist enters the most dangerous stage. The ego turns on itself. There is no one left outside to pull back, to reflect, to confirm. And when anger has nowhere left to be projected, it turns inward. Sigmund Freud called this state melancholia, not healthy sorrow, but pathological depression, in which the self is eroded from within. Unlike ordinary grief, melancholia does not allow a person to say, "I have lost someone." Instead, it whispers, "Something is fundamentally wrong with me." The narcissist is not consciously aware that they are suffering from the loss of love. They feel only an undefined emptiness, an unnamed collapse, a smouldering shame they cannot explain. Because in melancholia, the lost loved object does not disappear, it is internalized. And all the anger once directed outward now becomes self-contempt. This creates a profound paradox. The narcissist begins to unconsciously devalue themselves, while still having to maintain a facade of power. Outwardly, they may appear proud, cold, even successful. Inwardly, the ego is constantly attacked by wordless voices. I am not enough. I have been replaced. I am no longer special. This is why many narcissists at this stage experience prolonged anxiety, sleep disturbances, and depleted life energy, yet never call it grief. In melancholia, libido does not merely lose its object, it becomes trapped in a loop of self-attack. The narcissist cannot truly love another, nor can they love themselves. Any new supply, if it appears, only exposes the inner void more clearly. They may turn to busyness, status, or surface-level attention to cover the sense of collapse. But none of these reach the core of the problem. What was lost was not stimulation, but the experience of existing while being loved without having to perform. This is the stage at which many outsiders mistakenly believe the narcissist is fine. There is no longer overt obsession, no obvious attempts at control. Yet in reality, this is when the internal structure is at its most fragile. Melancholia does not erupt, it corrodes. It causes the ego to contract, to close in on itself, and gradually to lose the capacity for genuine connection with anyone. And here, a truth begins to take shape, though the narcissist cannot yet name it. They did not only lose a love, they lost the ability to return to their former ego state. No strategy can repair this. No apology is sufficient. No performance can replace it. Melancholia marks an irreversible moment where the narcissist continues to live, but a core part has collapsed forever. At this stage, the narcissist begins to act again not because they have recovered, but because melancholia has become unbearable. The inner void is no longer quiet. It demands something to fill it, immediately, and thus emergency replacement appears. They seek someone new, not slowly, not selectively, not waiting for genuine feeling to arise. The new person is not sought to be loved, but to prevent further ego collapse. According to Sigmund Freud, when libido cannot return to the self and cannot reattach to the lost object, it fragments, clinging to substitute objects with low intensity, little depth, and no capacity to endure. This is why relationships after true love for a narcissist often arrive quickly and remain shallow. There may be seduction, there may be drama, there may be an image of being fine from the outside. But internally, there is no rooting. The new object does not serve the psychological function that true love once did. They do not reflect the real person beneath the mask. They only reflect the role, and that is not enough to sustain an ego that was once deeply seen. The faster the replacements come, the more the narcissist realizes something they do not want to admit. The feeling does not return. Short-term satisfaction appears and fades. New attention does not soothe the old emptiness. And each time a new supply fails to reach the core, the sense of collapse deepens. Not because the new person is inferior, but because the lost function cannot be replicated. At this stage, many narcissists fall into a dangerous loop: seek bore, replace empty. Each cycle further erodes the capacity for genuine attachment. Libido is consumed by connections that lack sufficient force, leaving the psychological system increasingly exhausted. They may tell themselves they are moving on, but in reality, they are running from the memory of the one time they were loved without needing control. The most painful part is not that the new person is not good enough. It lies in the silent comparison the narcissist dares not voice. Why does that feeling never return? And that question, though buried, confirms an irreversible truth. True love left a structural imprint on their psyche. It did not disappear. It became an invisible standard against which every replacement fails. This stage does not end with healing. It ends with a bitter realization that they can continue living, continue having someone beside them, but will never return to the state they were in before losing true love. From here, the narcissist enters the final stretch of collapse. No hope of restoration, no illusion of repair, only a life that still functions, but lacks the living core that once existed. And then, after all the cycles of replacement, after every attempt to patch the ego with new attention, the narcissist begins to touch a wordless awareness. Not a clear conclusion, nor a healing awakening, but a deep, lingering, silent sense that something has left for which there is no path back. From this point, the question is no longer how to retrieve it, but what was truly lost. And when that question emerges, it opens directly into the core of collapse. What the narcissist can never recover is not you. People can be replaced, roles can be filled, stages can change actors. What was lost lies much deeper in an experience that only true love ever gave them. They cannot recover the feeling of being loved without having to perform, without display, without control, without adjusting an image to maintain power. The one time they were loved in that state, the ego did not have to strain. The persona did not need to operate. Defensive mechanisms were temporarily at rest. And precisely because of this, that experience became the sole exception in their emotional life, an exception that cannot be replicated. They also cannot recover the experience of being seen beneath the persona, not admired, but recognized, not exalted, but understood. When someone saw through the mask and stayed, the narcissist touched for the first time the possibility of existing as a human being, not a structure of power. And when that experience left, the persona returned, but no longer fully believed in itself, because there had once been a moment when it was set down. Sigmund Freud called this loss the loss of the ideal loved object, and for Freud, that meant the loss of a part of the ego, not symbolically, but structurally. Because the narcissist's ego had once invested a portion of its life energy into the experience of being loved. When that object disappeared, the part of the ego bound to it did not return intact. It left behind a permanent void, quiet, undramatic, but impossible to fill. From this point on, the narcissist may continue living, continue loving in their own way, continue functioning socially, but deep inside, they know, though they will never say it, that a state has closed. Not because someone left, but because they were once truly seen, and that moment cannot be repeated. The outcome of this story is neither punishment nor anyone's victory. The collapse of the narcissist after losing true love does not unfold like a theatrical tragedy. It occurs as a shift in the state of being quiet, prolonged, and irreversible. The narcissist is not destroyed by your departure. They continue to live, to function, to build new images, new relationships, new circles. But from the moment true love withdraws from their life, something fundamental changes. They can no longer return to the former version of their ego, the version that believed everything could be controlled, everyone could be replaced, and no loss could touch the core. Sigmund Freud pointed out that when a person loses the ideal loved object, they do not lose merely a relationship, but a part of the ego structure that had been attached to that object. For the narcissist, this is especially profound because their ego does not support itself. When the final anchor disappears, they do not collapse immediately, they contract. And that contraction shapes their entire emotional life thereafter. The most important thing to understand is this: your leaving was not an act of harm, but the moment when truth appeared. You did not break them. You were simply the only person who had ever seen them without a persona, and then did not stay to continue reflecting that image. It is precisely this absence, rather than words or confrontation, that put an end to an illusion on which they had been living. And if there is any ultimate meaning to this story, it does not lie with the narcissist. It lies with you. Because by leaving with clarity, without performing, without rescuing, without controlling, you closed a cycle that only someone who truly stepped out of illusion could close. The narcissist continues to live with what was lost. And you, the one who was loved, who saw, and who was lucid enough to leave, are the only one who does not carry that collapse into your own life.